Welcome to the Cutting the Gordian Knot podcast. Today we are joined by Dr. Vance. He is part of not one, not two, not 17, but 18 think tanks. He was formerly the chief economist of the White House Office of Management and Budget, and he is the host of the terrific podcast, Let People Prosper, something that my listeners need to listen to. So check that out, guys. Vance, thanks so much for coming on the show to talk about immigration.
Hey, Jake, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Awesome. Well, we've had 4 glorious years of the greatest of all border czars, and it's truly hard for me to fathom how we could really improve on the system that we have now. But nevertheless, you believe that the market is capable of a great many things, including making our immigration system somehow better than the wonderful state of affairs we have today. So I guess I'm going to start out with, what is the state of immigration? What do we need to know about it? And what would you even seek to improve with the market-based system?
Yeah, Jake, I mean, there's a lot to go into that overall, but I think it is important to start off where are we now? You understand your problem, and then you try to overcome it later and admit that there's a problem, which I think we will. Like, I say that there is a problem. It's a humanitarian crisis that's happening along the border. I live just north of Austin, Texas, in a place called Round Rock, Texas. And so I've seen the influence that this has had, especially along the border, and those that have ranches and families and, churches and schools. I mean, all this stuff is influenced by what's happened here. And of course, across the country, there have been effects as well. And so there's no surprise to your listeners that this stuff is going on. And of course, it's been a big talking point throughout the election cycle, and it likely will continue for a while as, the incoming President Trump, number 47 this time, which I was part of the first administration from June 2019 to May of 2020. So there was already a lot of talk about immigration then, the border wall and other things. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens now, as a lot of those things are still around, and the issues are still there. And in fact, what we see is, what can we do differently, and where are we at now? So where we're at now is that, from my estimation, there are between 11 to 12.5 million people that are here illegally, meaning that they didn't come through the legal channels to be an American citizen or get a green card or some sort of visa, HB1 or something else. And so there's about 11 to 12.5 million. Now, there are some numbers out there that show closer to 20 plus million, but a lot of those are encounters, not actually people. So you can have the same person being encountered or found or connected with along the border multiple times, many times, really. And so that can add up a lot over time. And so what we've seen really of the last 4 years is, in some sense, what some would argue maybe an open border policy, where you could just come over as much as you want. You're going to get lost in the system somehow. There's not really there's more of a catch and release sort of thing going on. Now, some states like Texas have tried to deal with some of those problems. And in fact, Texas has spent about $18 billion just since 2015 on border type issues, whether it be virtual sort of things to rein things in with cameras and drones and stuff like that. But also the last few years of continuing the border wall that was started under the Trump administration. And so I think, given the humanitarian crisis, and at the end of the day, Jake, I really think we should be treating people like people, and not just as numbers of immigrants and everything else. But and I'm a classical liberal, I'm more libertarian in a lot of ways, and so I'm not for an open border. I think, at being a republic, rule of law is really important. Private property rights are really important, and the rule of law and private property have really been hit hard over the last 4 years, really more than that, given the flood of people that have been coming over, and not just from Mexico. A lot of them, especially today, are coming from places in Central America, like Guatemala, places like that, where they have dictatorships that are basically hurting all their people, crashing their economy, and they are trying to find somewhere else to go. And so I think what we should have, instead of this system that controls the quantity of people that can come into the country through visas and green cards and everything else, is instead we should have a market-based system. And I'm glad to talk more in detail about that. But basically, it just follows a free market system that allows for prices to allocate where people want to go, and employers can pay for people to come here, or the people who want to work can pay to be here as well. It becomes more of a transaction, a trade that could take place, versus the government top-down approach that we have today. So I think hopefully that gives us a good place to start, and then kind of move on from there.
Gotcha. Yeah, I working in construction, I know my fair share of Mexicans.
Hmm.
And interestingly, they're all rabidly in favor of Donald Trump,
Hmm.
in part because all of them went through the proper process to either be a citizen or to get a green card. They stood in line, they went through it, they didn't cross illegally. So they really do feel like people who did cross illegally cheated.
Yeah.
And it's worse than that. They feel like they really betrayed their country because the biggest problem in Mexico is the cartels. I mean, recently we saw the elections where, what was it, like 70 people got assassinated by the
Yeah.
cartel? It's, I mean, we are just, it's borderline failed state over there. It's like a narco state.
Hmm.
And they reminded me that, no, the border is secure. It's secure from the other side.
Hmm.
Nobody crosses unless you're with the cartel, and we already have a market. It's on the other side.
Hmm.
People pay the cartel in order to go across. The rates of sexual violence against women are staggering.
Yeah.
The times that people just get robbed, and then it doesn't even end there. They're actually tracked when they get inside of the nation. And if they ever come back, they say, oh, hang on, you've been here for 5 years. You've been working for 5 years, so you owe us money. And they have
Hmm.
people here in the United States who actually keep tabs on
Hmm.
various immigrants in order to know what to extract. So it's a pretty scary situation we have right now. And in a sense, what we're talking about is taking the job of securing the border away from some of the worst human beings on earth, the cartels and human traffickers, and putting it in the hands of the nation whose border it is. It's a crazy idea, I know. And
Right.
instead of having money go to people who are going to use that to traffic more fentanyl and reinvest in American carnage, we could have it fund our border patrol or go into the coffers of our near broke federal government, borrowing
Yeah.
with his
Yeah.
hand out to capital markets every waking moment. But
One thing, Jake, there too is to your point about the politics is in South Texas that's historically been very blue,
mm,
Democrat held area from Congress to state representatives to state senators and everything else, and basically since 2020 that has flipped. There, it's now
mm,
pretty dark red, whether you consider the congressional members or state members, and voting for Trump here in the 2024 election has turned more red than it was before. And a lot of it goes back to what you were just saying, is that they're seeing this directly affect their area that they live. And they see people that are coming here illegally whenever they were the ones that stood in line. Now, we could just debate whether how long they stayed in line and whether that was a good thing or not. But
mhm,
but they did. They went through the proper processes. And I also think, though, to your other point, is that they do understand that the cartels are a major problem in Mexico, and that there needs to be something to deal with the flow of people and the issues that are happening in Mexico at the same time, which the Biden administration has not been willing to confront over the last 3.5 years. I mean, Vice President Kamala Harris, or presidential contender, was the border czar. I think she maybe went to the border maybe once, if
mhm.
that.
That's
And
all
so,
she needed. All
yeah,
she
that
needed.
it's just crazy to think about what's been happening here over the last few years.
So I'm very interested in what you can imagine as a market system, because I think we are entering a time where so many things we thought weren't possible.
Mm.
The president, Senate, probably a House,
Mm-hmm.
a Supreme Court. We got a lot on our side, and we can actually start getting some stuff done. So, I mean, the first point I want to have is what we're talking about is, yes, people. We're talking about laborers. We're talking about the chance to work. And there's a sense in which we already have a market for labor that goes cross border. It's called trade, right? So if you're working in Mexico and you're making a car, and then that car sold to the US, then your labor is crossing the border, even if the laborer isn't.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a sense in which this happens one way or another, and that we ought to be open to a movement of laborers if we're open to movements of trade and
Mm.
comparative advantage, especially if these workers have comparative advantages. And I think in large part they do, but it won't get ahead of myself. I'm going to let you kind of blue sky. We make you surprised. The border czar. Didn't know that a czar was an American post.
Right.
Who knows? Maybe that's kind of like a callback to communism. We won't get into that. But You are now the border czar. Um, what do you do?
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question, and I think the place to start are a couple of things. One is that I do think it's important to make sure that we have a secure border.
Hmm.
Um, I, I would like to look more into the details of exactly how effective that the border wall has been, and
Hmm.
where instead of building border walls and spending money, that we could use some virtual types and drones and things of that nature to allow for us to have a better idea of where people are coming and going. Also, getting a better idea of what's happening across the border. To your point earlier about the coyotes and the cartels and everything else, and address that a lot of this is being pushed from that side of the border onto us. I don't think a lot of Americans know that and don't see some of those things. And so bringing that to fruition will be really important. But with all of that, I do think that there is a big need for immigration reform. And I know that some on the right will kind of bristle and say, I don't
Yeah.
want to do that. And there was a bill, I guess it was earlier this year, where there would have been some immigration type reforms. Um, I have my questions about it, and I don't think that it was the right necessarily way to go. But at least there was an attempt that we haven't seen now in years, and it didn't go anywhere. But at least there was an attempt, and so I think this is why the time is ripe, as you mentioned, putting in the political landscape that we're in now. A Republican president with Trump, Republican Senate for sure, with probably I think it's 54 votes
Hmm.
now.
I think so.
Yeah. And then the House, where we still don't quite know as we're recording this, but it could be 1 or 2 votes majority for the Republicans in the House. So there could be a trifecta, if you will, of Republicans. And so this is a great opportunity, I think, to show the world and America what we can do as far as what free markets is all about. And I'm also a Christian, so I believe strongly in that people were created to flourish no matter
Hmm.
where we are. We have the fall of sin, but and we have to live with those obstacles along the way. But through Jesus Christ, we're able to overcome the obstacles that we have and are saved. And so I think we should be able to flourish no matter where we're at. And God put us in this situation to allow us to flourish. But at the same time, we have to understand that there are rules of law. And yes, there are the big rules of law from the Bible sent down from God. But at the same time, there are going to be those rules that are here in on earth. And so what we know in America is that there are these border walls, there are other things that are going on. So how can we make sure that we are not only doing what's best for America, because there's this America First sort of crusade going on, while also allowing for people from outside of America to continue to be this melting pot here of new ideas and innovation. Because if you think about it, a lot of the employers and new innovations are coming from non-native Americans.
Oh yeah.
Elon Musk is a great example of that.
My
And
favorite African American.
yeah, man, yeah. And then you have other things going on, like all of us who are at some point migrated to America. And so I have a problem with us saying, well, we just need to close the border or not let people in entirely. I don't think that's a good thing longer term, not only fiscally and economically and everything else, but also just coming back to the Christian nature of it. I believe that we should want to help people. But let's make sure it's done in the right way. And I think this is where this market-based approach can come in, is that if there is a high demand for labor, meaning that it's a tight labor market here in America, we can't find anyone to work, whether it be in construction, your business, or other types of manufacturing or other things that are out there, that we should have the opportunity to bring in those people, pay the amounts that are the fees. Maybe it's I don't know. It depends what the market price is going to set. When there's high
Hmm.
demand, the price is going to be higher. Maybe it's up to $100,000. Maybe it's 50,000. Maybe it's 20,000. I don't know what the price is. I don't want to be the dictator of a one size fits all policy of the knowledge problem that Hayek talked about. But I want to let the market process, the spontaneous order, begin to work, and then we can know who the people are that are here. And if people want to be here, they'll also have a willingness to pay. And if they're able to pay that amount, then they could also pay those amounts to come over here as well. And I think having a market-based system in place that's set by supply and demand, and the prices that are there, and the fees that I guess are set in place by the government as well, we would not only be able to track the people that are here more closely. I don't mean from a big government sort of perspective, but just knowing who is here, I think, is really important. And at the same time, we can meet the demands of the workforce, because a lot of people think about the labor market and they'll say, oh, well, if we have more immigrants, that's going to increase supply of labor and reduce everyone's wages. The fact of the matter is that's not how it works, because when you look at the actual research on this, there are different levels of the labor market. There's low
Hmm.
skilled, mid skilled, high skilled. And so the ones that are coming primarily over from Mexico and Central America are not competing with mid skilled and high skilled workers. because English isn't their first language, and maybe they don't have the same level of education. And so they're usually competing with lower skilled workers, like in construction. I'm not trying to say anything bad about different workers, but just the levels of
Sure.
education and things of that nature. But that's the area that they most compete with. So those workers can see a lower wage. Supply increases and then demand stays the same. You get lower wages for them. At the same time, the goods that they buy tend to come from low wage areas or low skilled sort of products, and so that increases demand for those same items. And so now you get an increased supply, increase in demand. So now it depends on what's going to happen to wages and prices. But at the end of the day, you get more economic growth, more prosperity. And so I think, Jake, that we need to take a step back sometimes and think about, okay, we're trying to cast out immigrants as just being, be blunt, rapists or murderers or other things. And that's not always the case. In fact, most often it's not. There's research that shows that the native workers have a higher criminal rating, rate of committing a crime, I should say it that way, compared to those that are migrating here from other, and that's including illegal, but especially legal immigrants have a much lower rate than those that are Native Americans. And so I think by discussing some of these things, as borders are, which I would hate to have that position, but if I did, those are the types of things that I would want to look at. Figure out exactly where we're at. Educate Americans on where things are heading for the future, the pros and the cons, which I don't think we look at the pros as often as we should. And then figure out how can we have a best market-based approach that works in every other market that we like. Why shouldn't we have it as something as important as labor and other people trying to come here to make their lives better from other countries? That's kind of how I see it.
I think you're hitting exactly the balance that I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
I wish we had more disagreement. The listeners love that stuff, but I don't think we're going to get it. It's on the one side, we are a country. We have borders. Just like if you have a family, your family has borders. You have a home. You don't just let people just walk in. It's not because you hate them. It's not because you're racist. No. It's because, well, you love what's inside, and that requires some type of border. A cell has a phospholipid bilayer, not because it hates everything else in the world, but because it needs to keep some type of homeostasis inside. So we need some type of domestic homeostasis. We need to, yes, put America first, but that doesn't necessarily exclude extending neighborly love to other groups. I think that oftentimes we think of American first as whenever America can get anything, we should take it. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that would be true if we're in desperate need of something and some group that we don't have any responsibility for is in need of something, then we have a duty to care for the people that God gave us first and then to extend that care for others. But when we're talking about the world's most prosperous ever nation, and the question is actually, will we become more prosperous or less prosperous? And if the answer to that is with immigration, they become more prosperous and we become more prosperous, then it's not a question of duty and need as much as, I think, neighborly love.
Yeah.
And I mean, I always appreciate when not all the guests for economic issues are religious at all, but I feel like it's a giant, just like, we can jump over a lot of stuff that we don't have to argue. We don't have to get into the natural law of this or that. We can simply say, one time a guy rolled up to Jesus and they're talking. He says, what are the greatest commandments? And he gets it right. And he goes, hey, but who is my neighbor?
Yeah.
Jesus is just like, parable.
Yeah.
And the answer of the parable is everybody's your neighbor.
Yeah.
So as a Christian duty, it's like, all right, well, who's my neighbor? Just the people in my community? No, everybody's your neighbor.
Yep.
Like it or not.
Yep.
So, and then in the Old Testament, we have all sorts of wonderful laws that everybody forgets. One of which is, it says you have to have the same law for the foreigner and the person who lives among you. Because what they're trying to do is not to create this second-class group of citizens, because they said, they're not technically part of Israel, but they are people made in the image of God. Therefore, we extend the same protections of law to them. Another one that I love is they say if you're a merchant, you can't have two different weights. You can't have an extra weight in your pocket. Because when you weigh the value of somebody else's labor, you have to weigh it consistently, whether this is from a Gentile nation or internally. You must use the same weight. Oh my goodness. So for those of us who say, well, I don't really care about all these Mexicans coming in working and, they could be competing with this and that. It's like, no, no, no. Don't have two weights in your pocket. Have one. Say, is this workman worthy of his wages or not? That's your question. He's your neighbor. And if you don't think that it's valuable to hire him, then don't.
Yeah.
If you do, then you've both benefited. And to kind of extend out a thought experiment, for those of you who are listening and thinking, right, but I mean, he said that, the high wage, mid-wage people aren't going to be hit by a supply shock, but don't we care most about the low-wage people? Aren't they the ones that they could bounce off poverty? Well, just imagine for a second if we said, we have an economy and a population in the U.S. of 10 people, and then we have a supply shock of 10 more. Do you think we get wealthier or not? I think we would, especially if they have different skills.
Right.
That'd really be nice. I think a large reason why the U.S. is so successful and so wealthy is we're probably the largest free trade zone in the world. And we have a wildly diverse group of trade partners. We have Mexico, we have Canada, we can trade east and west. This is great. We get to benefit from the differences of various laborers, and that's a wonderful thing. So the specifics of the system, my friend, you mentioned supply and demand, and this is tricky because although demand is, we could just have bidding for spots for, say, a various labor market or a time in the U.S. in order to work or for citizenship or for whatever else. I get how we could get demand. Maybe there's questions of if this is going to be just one giant market or if we'll split it up whereby we have Mexico has one market and China has another. What do you do with supply? How does the market deal with supply? Because this is something that it seems a little tricky for. So what's your idea for how we determine the supply of these spots?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point, and I appreciate everything you just said there. I agree with what you said, and one other thing just about the rule of law and borders is just private property. It's just so important, right? To your point about what's inside your home versus what's outside. You want to go after your home first and make sure we're all okay, and then you look at what's outside as well. But that brotherly love, that neighborly feeling is so important. But on this point about demand and supply, you're right. Demand, I think, can be easier to imagine of what that would look like in a market-based system, given that, these employers are looking at their profit and losses and they're determining how much it's costing them to hire an American, or if there are Americans that are available for this job, or should they start looking elsewhere? And this is one of the areas where I think we too often will point our fingers at Mexico or foreign workers, but we got to remember we have three fingers pointing back at us. So where we oftentimes have too high of costs for workers here in America, whether that be from the personal income taxes or corporate income taxes or the minimum wage, labor unions, licensing, occupational licensing. I go through a whole long list, which I work on a lot of these issues with a lot of the think tanks that you mentioned earlier.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I'm trying. And so all of those things oftentimes create a barrier for employers in America to hire Americans. I also think this is one reason why we're not as competitive as we otherwise could be on the global playing field with China and other countries when we talk about trade, is that we're too often to point our fingers at other countries whenever we should be looking internally to reduce the cost of doing business. We're doing a disservice to ourselves, And so you have all that stuff going on the demand side. But if you come up to the supply side, I think it is trickier in the sense that, okay, how many people are we going to have, right? So today in the current system, you have a certain number of H-1B visas. And out of those H-1B visas, so these are the educated folks that are coming here to go to college, and then they usually get stay for a year or two after that. But they may be coming from anywhere in the world to get a master's or a PhD at one of these institutions. And a lot of times they go back. It's like, okay, well, they came over here to educate themselves and get smarter, yet we send them out of the United States because their visa will expire. That doesn't seem right to me, especially if you're thinking about growing economy and having more Thomas Edisons and others, Adam Smiths or whoever you want to say, Milton Friedman. We can have a lot of different people that are coming in. But I also think there will be some more self-selection. Supply is tough because and I've talked about some folks about this on my podcast, on the Let People Prosper show, and they've actually come from other countries to the United States. Veronique de
Okay.
Rougy, who works at Mercatus Center, came from France. And I've talked to some other people, Venezuela, Daniel Di Martino, who came from Venezuela. It's very tough to leave the country that you love and that you grew up and that you were born in, possibly, or most times, to leave everything you knew to go to another country. Now,
Mhm.
speaking of from personal from my personal story, is I haven't been to very many other countries. I grew up pretty low income, a single mom. My dad had epilepsy, so he was on Social Security, so we didn't have a lot of income, and a sister and everything. But we didn't travel really at all growing up, and I haven't been to too many countries now. And the one time that I've lived outside of Texas was when I moved to Virginia to work at the White House for that year. But I'm going to tell you, it was kind of tough to like leave Texas, just leave a state in the same
Mhm.
country to go to a different state was tough. And so I can only imagine what many of these people are feeling whenever they're leaving their country, their place that they love, and most of their family, and going somewhere else. And maybe part of that is incentivized through the coyotes and cartels and something else. There's a lot of people who are just wanting to go to America to make their lives better off. And so I think in this market-based system, to go back to your question, Jake, which is an important one, is how do we determine to my the way that I like to see this is that we wouldn't have to determine who is coming from which countries. Is that it
Mhm.
would be who wants to come, and then you allow for the market price to set itself such that the people who can afford it and can find ways to get over here would come, and those who couldn't would not. Now that doesn't mean that we wouldn't have refugees or others who are fleeing. That we would also have a certain number of those coming in. But I do think that having a market-based system where the employer and the workers are better able to pay for these rates, if you will, that are set
Mhm.
in the marketplace, we would have people that would continue to come and fill the jobs that are needed and allow for people to be better off in their future. So it's totally radical compared to our current system today. And I get that. And there needs to be some more, checks and balances throughout the process. And I get all that as well. But ultimately, that's my idea of where we would see things go. And I should mention that, look, I'm not the one who created this. Richard Vedder, who is an economist that's been talking about this stuff for a long time, he talked a lot about market-based visas and the way that this would be created. There's a good book out of the Texas Tech Ben Powell Free Market Institute where Richard Vedder has a chapter in there talking about specifically on this topic here. And it fascinated me to where I kept doing research on it and finding other things about it. And so I think it is a process, just like most things, of how do we improve it over time. So I'd love to get your thoughts as well, Jake. But that's kind of how I'm seeing things so far.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. I have thought about this a little bit, and by a little bit, I mean, oh no, Vance Ginn's coming on the show on Monday. I need to come up with something. Um, so the one thing I noticed was the distribution of immigrants causes problems.
Yeah.
And there's a big money where your mouth is problem. We saw what happened when we bust some people over to Martha's Vineyard. They freaked
Mm-hmm.
out. And it doesn't seem fair that we can, say, have New England vote for higher immigration when that disproportionately swamps, say, small Texas towns. So instead, I mean, one idea I had is what if we just had states determine how many people they wanted to give residency and a ability to legally work in their state,
Yeah.
and then we have the total supply of spots in the U.S. determined by states.
Hmm.
And then once you do that, it gets far more complicated. One
Sure.
option is you then have to have a sponsor, and the sponsor can be a company. The sponsor can be a bank, right? I could see banks coming in or even insurance companies saying, we'll front the money for you
Yeah.
to bid and win a spot. And then you'll be in the US and then you'll just pay us back as you go. And then once you get a sponsor, could be a church, could be a community organization. But once you have that spot, you can arrive and you can live and work in that state. And then you mentioned earlier tracking. I think this sounds very Big Brother and creepy, but I
Yeah.
don't think that we should have tracking for American citizens. But maybe if you bid for a spot as an American citizen, you have, say, a 3-year probation.
Mm-hmm.
And during that period of time, you're a guest here until you become permanent.
Hmm.
Or if you just got a work permit, you're a guest here to work. You're a guest worker. So we track a few basic things.
Yeah.
Like, have you committed a crime?
Hmm.
Or maybe some things which we can universally say just are bad for society. Like, have you had a divorce?
Hmm.
Have you paid taxes? Are you a net taxpayer?
Hmm.
Right? Some pretty basic things. And then I would like to score the immigrants based on those factors from each sponsoring organization.
Hmm.
And then we create a ranking of the sponsors and we go, oh my goodness, JP Morgan brings these people in, whatever their selection process is, seems very good. Maybe they require character references. I don't know.
Yeah.
But their group have assimilated effectively, have not committed crimes, and seem to have good civic engagement.
Hmm.
They get to have an expanded amount of the proportion of that state's cap. And then we slowly can evolve this where now they're in competition for the best way to find the immigrants. And this is no longer in the hands of some overloaded federal bureaucracy, which
Right.
somehow needs to determine the moral character of these people. Instead, we just allow different suppliers to supply us with people who wish to come and then compete based on how effective they are in doing that. I would imagine that they're going to extend services like English as a second language or ways to find a home because we might track, are they living in a stable environment? Did they purchase property or who knows what?
Yeah.
So I would like to see that. Another option is we have counties. Once let's say Virginia says we want to take 1,000,000 people in. Well, then we have the counties in this, we have independent cities in Virginia. So the counties and independent cities would then bid for these immigrants. And we allow the bidding to go positive or negative.
Mm-hmm.
So if all of them say, no, I'm sorry, we're overloaded, you're going to have to pay us state. Then at that point, they would have to reduce their cap because all their counties have said no. And then we allow the bidding process to set what the counties themselves as a group, and then they disperse to the counties whose local political environment has determined we can take these people in the most. They're buying property, they're working here, they're benefiting the people who actually know them. And we don't have to just guess from New England or whether or not they benefit people. It can be actually put to a local population. That doesn't necessarily, for me, solve what we do with people who are, say, seeking political asylum. Personally, I think that we should have a very strong process to investigate some of those. And I don't actually think we should be charging them prices if it's an actual claim. I think that's just an act of mercy we do nationally to people who are in actual peril. I don't think you're in peril if you crossed 12 nations in order to get here.
Right.
I don't think so. I think you're an economic migrant. But if you're coming here based on economic, principles, then I think it's very fair to say, we and our parents, our grandparents have all paid taxes, have all contributed to this nation. We're just asking you to pay for the right to immediately use all the things that we've built up, all the capital, all the social capital. You benefit day one. So we'd like you to kind of put something out there. You now have skin in the game. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
So that would be my idea for how we would set the supply.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. And I'm a huge fan of federalism. I think we should be devolving most things from the federal government to the states or ultimately to the people. And the more that you can have local, to your point about counties or even cities, I mean, that would even get closer to the people. And really, to your point, I mean, we saw some of what the disruption that happened when Governor Abbott started busing people to other states. Now, we could argue whether or not that was just a press ploy to highlight the cost of what's happening in Texas, because that did create disruptions. But I think it also opened people's eyes to what's really happening across much of the southern border. And so there is some key issues that are going on there. But no, I definitely agree with you that it would be better to devolve things to the states as much as possible. I mean, the federal government running $36 trillion in debt and having $2 trillion a year in deficits, they're already overloaded with way too much. And that stuff needs to go away. And so a big part of my work is also to try to figure out, how do you devolve more stuff to the states? Whether we get rid of the Department of Education, which I don't think we should have any role of the federal government doing with education. Healthcare needs to be changed dramatically. We should have block grants to states instead of the Medicaid matching assistance program that they have today. But a big part of this too goes back to my favorite economist, Milton Friedman, says you can't have open borders and a welfare system. That basically a free immigration and a welfare system. And I think that's right. I mean, there is a huge cost. The issue is that when do they really start getting on welfare? Because illegals, they're illegal. So technically they can't get on most of our welfare programs.
Correct.
There are some that they get IDs and other things and do it illegally. But again, that's illegal. That's not part of our system. It's usually the second or third generation before you really start to see more of them getting on welfare. The first generation oftentimes does not get on welfare. For one, they can't get on it, or even if they get here a visa or something, they can't get on it. And they're often productive. Like they don't want to be on the welfare system. So I think that's kind of overblown, but it does go to the point that we need some sort of welfare reforms here in America that also will reduce the cost of people staying home who are native-born Americans.
Agreed.
Too often, there's a huge trade-off right now of I would stay home and get these X, Y, and Z programs, and I'm going to have my reservation wage, but I'd reserve my labor to work. That's going to be very high because I can live off the government's dole, right? And meaning taxpayers are paying for that. And that's a whole other issue that's creating supply and demand problems within the labor market. And this is one reason why I did a recent study at the Americans for, it was through Tholos Foundation, who is also connected with Americans for Tax Reform, is to say, what would the cost of Medicare be if we had amnesty? And then what would it be if we had Medicare for all, which Kamala Harris has said she's been in favor of both of those over time. And just if you look at Medicare and our current system, and you track when people become eligible, because you've got to pay into Medicare 120 qualified payments, so basically 40 quarters, so 10 years. So I was trying to get at there. You basically have to be in 10 years. So what would that eligibility look like? It would cost about $1.8 trillion over time for those immigrants, about 11 to 12 and a half illegal immigrants here today. If you had Medicare for all, it would be $44 trillion with $2 trillion for those that are amnesty. So we're talking about massive amounts of money that we can't even pay for what we have today. So this isn't just an immigration issue. It's a fiscal issue. It's a monetary issue because now we've got to print a lot of that money and create inflation, and that puts people into different tax brackets. And so there are a lot of other repercussions that I think can be helped by allowing for market forces to work more, including in labor. And the amount of immigration, I think, will help us out tremendously because it also helps for more people to be paying into our system, even though there is a longer-term cost for a lot of folks, especially younger immigrants. They have longer time to pay into taxes for the welfare system and Medicare and things of that nature, and also helping us to grow our economy faster than we otherwise would. Because one thing, Jake, when you look at the numbers, our population, the native-born population, is flat to declining in many places across the country. And given that labor and capital and productivity are the three key things that you need to grow an economy, if we're going to have reductions or flatlining in labor and capital and productivity maybe don't increase as fast, we're going to have major economic issues that are going to continue to come about. And so that's why this issue of immigration is just so important.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. A lot of these people who come over first off, I read that article.
Okay, good.
Those are terrifying numbers.
Yes.
A lot of, but as conservatives, I think in general, we want a strong border policy. That's great. But a lot of conservatives can kind of get into this like reflexive dislike of every possible effect of immigration. It's like, I like what you said earlier about the crime rates. Yeah, they're actually lower. Like that's just from what we know, this is the way it is, guys. If it rose above the average rate, then that would be a good reason to start to decline and try to weed out, But it's not only that. From what I've seen, and you'll probably know more than I know about it, is in net, they seem to be more net taxpayers, which are immigrants, than native born. I mean, net taxpayers are more rare than one might think. You only find them in the very top tax brackets, actually, when you actually look at net. And a lot of these people, they'll borrow Social Security numbers or forge them, and then they're paying in for payroll and income and Social Security tax, and they're never going to get that out.
Right.
Not just because they might just return to their nation of origin and retire, but because they might not actually be able to effectively file the paperwork because who knows what they used in order to make it in the first place.
Right.
So they're paying into a lot of these programs and never getting it out.
No.
And they're not subject to, or the illegal ones aren't, in theory, subject to a lot of the programs that we typically extend to the poor. So at the end of the day, it's like they, as you said, increase the supply of labor. I also think that because they're complementary, not just competitive workers, they actually increase our productivity when we work together.
Yep.
So they're growing the size of the economy. And when we deal with, say, the $32 trillion in debt, well, that number looks a lot more manageable if our GDP number looks a little bit bigger too. And they're actually actively helping us shoulder the burden. So when they come to our shores, yes, they get the benefits of our institution, but they also get the burden of our national debt. And they're actually helping us pay for the fact.
Yeah.
Oh,
It kind of seems like a win-win-win, across the board. It's just, um, it, and maybe this goes back to what you were saying earlier, though. The politics get into this. I mean, I think some of this has to do with winning elections. I mean,
right.
Public choice economics shows us that politicians are just as rational as the people in the public. It's just that they have a different set of marginal costs and marginal benefits, with one of those being win a re-election. And so they've got to have something out there to point to say, this is a problem. We've got to do something about it. And something, Jake, that I like to mention a lot is we hear oftentimes about market failures and how the market fails, whether it be monopoly or externalities and other things. What I feel, or not just feel, but find in the data and the research, is that government failures are more costly than any of those perceived market failures.
Agreed.
Because they come in, they redistort our behavior. And, there's this whole behavioral economics, which really economics is the study of human action and interaction within institutions. Exactly. Yeah. But too many people have made it about the stock market or about Greg Mankiw, which I used to use his textbook when I taught economics, but in there it said something like the study of using scarce resources efficiently and effectively. I was always like, what the heck does that even mean? Is it cats? Is it dogs? Is it horses? No, it's people. We're talking about humans and how they act within all these institutions to satisfy our desires given scarce resources. And when we think about that, one of the most scarce things we have, right, is time. And next to that is the number of humans that we have. I mean, we're up to what? Almost 8 billion, 7 plus billion people across the globe. We're only 330 million people here in America. And so to think about what we've done over such a short period of time in America, which I believe is the greatest place in the world and has the greatest amount of economic growth, but I think there's a lot more that we can do. And if we don't internalize and figure out how we can be better off in the process, while also acknowledging that we're going to be neighborly to those, the weak, tired, and poor from other places, and be able to do good, not force them to do good. I think this is one thing that, the Christians, some people will say, well, Jesus was a socialist and some of the things he said. And the way that I take this anyway is that it was more about your private property, right? Like you giving your rewards from God to those that are most in need, not being taken from you and then redistributed, to where whenever you have this happen in America, one of the most efficient governments across the globe, I'll put scare quotes around efficient, but only 60 cents of every dollar goes to the people we're actually trying to help. Whereas the private money, nonprofits, things of that, charity, for example, at least 90%, there's going to be some overhead, but at least 90% is going to go to the people we're trying to help. And I think that is where we also need to look more with immigration, of how these people are benefiting, which they benefit substantially compared to the places that they were leaving before, which makes the total pie grow faster for the global economy. And I know some of my good friends who are more on the America First part of this be like, well, I don't really care about them on the outside. I'm worried about Americans. And I was like, I am too. But the more that the world grows and the more income and richer that people are across the globe, the more they're going to buy from us. The more peace I believe that we will have. And the more human flourishing we can have, which God created us to have in the first place. So it all comes back around.
Absolutely. So what do you think about the role of remittances? This one I recently heard, I forget who it was. It might have been Trump. It might have been Vance. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on any of this.
Okay.
But something to the effect of they wanted to tax remittances. And this one drove me yumpy.
Yeah.
Because you think about where that's going, and is typically a young worker comes over to America because their wife and kids is A, too dangerous for them to come, two, they're not going to be able to work productively as easily. So it's often like a young man will come across the border to work, then they'll pay remittances back to, say, to take care of their wife and kids who don't have an earner there in the native country. Or in other cases, it's to take care of elderly parents. That's super, super common. And the idea, these people have come this far, and they worked so hard in things which most Americans don't want to do. And they've traded their labor for wages, which often aren't that high in difficult work. And then they're sending it back to the people who are vulnerable in other nations who desperately need this. And we think this is a money grab opportunity. This is not much money. This has a tremendous effect, not only on those people's lives, but on the country that sent those people to work in our economy in the first place. This can't think morally. I don't care. Economically speaking, I'll go all day long about what I think can grow the American economy. And that's great. But there are certain policies which are just a hard roadblock for me if they, in my opinion, are immoral. This one, I'm sorry, we're just going to have to find another way to raise that very small amount of money because I see that as incredibly, wildly destructive. I couldn't stop from the tirade, but where I was going was, you teach economics. Give us the kind of the economic story about what happens there. Because some people think, well, they're sending money away from the American economy. Why does this hurt them?
Yeah.
And then we have to ask the question, well, what do they do with that money once it reaches them? How does it return? In what form does it return? So kind of sketch out what exactly happens with remittances. Is this just draining the United States of economic power? Is it actually enriching us and helping us in another way? Tell us what remittances do.
Yeah, Jake. No, it's a great point. And you laid it out already eloquently about what happens there, right? Mostly, it tends to be mostly the younger immigrants who are sending money back, but it doesn't have to be. Older ones do that as well to help out grandkids and kids and things of that nature. And, it reminds me of someone, let's say they're living in Texas and then they grow a family. They have their kids that stay in Texas and then they move to Virginia. And now their kids live back in Texas and they decide, you know what, I still want to help out my kids and my grandkids. And so I'm going to send money back to Texas. I think we would all start protesting if they tried to tax us for how much we're sending back to Texas at some sort of tax rate and say, well, there's something wrong with that. And you can't send all that money back, Vance, and they tax me for that. I think we would all be up in arms about that. Well, why does it matter if it's across the border? Why does it matter? And I think it becomes of this idea right now of this fixed pie, where if I'm gaining, you're losing. I think this is around the whole immigration story, really, is that Americans are losing because foreigners are winning. Or in trade, America's losing because we have a trade deficit, and so therefore the other country is winning. But this is a fixed fixed pie sort of idea. In trade, you have people who win-win, or they don't trade. They both 100%. Benefit from that mutual exchange. And so I think that going back to the remittances, though, it's very important for us to have that opportunity for those individuals to send money back, because when that happens, the place, let's say it is sending back to their kids are going to be better off than they otherwise would. Maybe they can have better clothes. Maybe they can have better food. Maybe they can have better shelter. And so they're going to be in a better situation than probably their parents did who decided to leave. I would argue that they are going to be in much better position if they're able to do that. And if they do that, they will be in a better position to make reforms within their own country that could be peaceful, that can get rid of cartels, because if you keep those other people poor by not allowing for those remittances to take place, you're not going to see any changes. And in fact, it'll become worse because those who are in power, the cartels, the politicians, other leaders, will have more power over time because they will be able to make everyone feel like they're enslaved because they don't have opportunities to improve their livelihood. And oftentimes, the disenfranchised are in a situation where they just can't. And so those remittances, I would argue, are a huge part of allowing for more opportunity to let people prosper, is the way I like to put it, but to live more of God's calling. I mean, we were blessed to live in America and be born here. And I think that is a great thing. I don't know what I would do if I was born somewhere else. But I also think it's important for us to help others, no matter where they are, and to get away from this fixed pie mentality of I win, you lose. Yes, we have competition, there's marketplace, and I want people to win and all of that. But when you're in a marketplace, you both win or you don't exchange. And one last thing I'll leave here, Jake, on this point is there's a lot of talk about income inequality, and how the poorer areas have much lower incomes than the upper income areas, so they have this huge divide. Well, one way to reduce that is to have both of them grow at the same time. And oftentimes what you see with more economic freedom is more economic mobility and lower inequality, because the lower income folks move at a faster rate up the income ladder than the upper incomes continue to go up. And so I'm okay with them continuing to both go up, but I want to see, and therefore inequality going down, but I don't want to force redistribution from upper income people to lower income people, because that leads to worse outcomes, and it becomes more of this fixed pie mentality instead of allowing for the entire pie to continue to grow. So I probably way too long for the remittances sort of answer, but there's so many parts that go into that.
Well, yeah, you kind of brought up something I didn't really see coming that I really, really like. And that is there's, money does confer. It's not the only way to have power, but money does give you a certain ability to resist oppression, to be mobile, to maybe protect yourself in a variety of ways. And in countries where it's a corrupt government or an evil cartel, and you send remittances back to people who are the families of hardworking people, you are shifting the power dynamic in that country. And that's so great. If people don't take any point away from that, that's a really unique point. And I really like it.
Yeah, man. And we see this every day in America, right? Like people are leaving California and New York and Illinois and going to Texas and Virginia and Florida and other places because people move with their feet, and they want to flee those what I would consider big government progressive states and are heading more to more limited government places. Why would we want that with other countries as well?
Yeah, we are kind of having a survival of the fittest.
Yeah,
in that that's good. Yeah, let's evil nations. Let's take the people out and put them in good nations. I get the logic there. The other thing I was thinking with the remittances was, what's the counterfactual? Okay, the immigrant comes in and he's in the U.S. and you didn't want him to spend anything, so or send any money out, so he just spends it all into the American economy. Oh, that's great. At least he bought American goods. Like, all right, what do you think that his family did with dollars in Mexico? It's like at some point, the worth of those dollars is the ability to import from the United States goods and services. It's like, so what's the difference? They were both spent on American goods and services, or else maybe they were used by that family to purchase, say, assets like stocks or bonds, at which point they become investment. Oh, is this a problem? So either it seems to be the same as if they had just done all their spending inside, or it becomes investment, at which point it's better. And it also benefits the people in the other nation, and it changes the power dynamic of those inside of the nation, which is a point that I'll remember.
Yes.
That's a big deal. That's a big deal. I do want to bring up another morality issue, and that is we both believe patriotism is a virtue. And, Thomas Aquinas talks about how he actually quotes Aristotle in saying patriotism is actually one of the chief political virtues because it's like a properly ordered love of nation. And it's an acknowledgement of gratitude that you've been given an incredible gift by a benefactor. In this case, the benefactor being your nation, right? You get rule of law, you get roads, you get civic institutions. You didn't work to get any of that. You were just born and poof, it was there. So he compares it, and actually all the way back in the Jewish tradition is compared to the type of honor that we owe our parents. So you hear like the rabbinic tradition talk about patriotism is derivative of the fourth commandment, to honor thy father and thy mother. And they say honor, in fact, sometimes in Latin is rendered worship, to render worth to father and mother because you were given a gift, specifically life, something you could never repay. So when you're given something you can never repay, you can't give back payment by definition. So instead, what you give is honor. So obviously we have, honor a father and mother. Another place is be patriotic to render honor to your nation. This give you things that you can't repay. And the final, and greatest level, of course, is to honor God. And that type of honor is religion. It's just the virtue of religion is then kind of the equivalent of patriotism or honor of father and mother. All that is set up to say, today's, I read the mass readings each morning, and today's, funny enough, was about, there's always occasions for sin, Jesus says, but woe to he who sets an occasion for sin and causes somebody to stumble. It's better if you just tie a millstone around their neck and drown them in the sea. So I don't want to be the type of people who need a drowning event.
No.
Which means I don't want to be the type of person who sets up incentives for people to choose vice instead of virtue, to people have an opportunity to sin. And one sin can be a sin against patriotism, not honoring one's nation. I met one fellow from Syria, and he worked in the Assad regime as a civil engineer. And when the whole Civil War thing happened, he's like, yeah, I don't like this. I'm going to go to America. It'll be great. I'll just be a civil engineer here. And he left. And I thought, well, something that just strikes me wrong about that. Because in the aftermath of that Civil War, what's like the most needed dude possible? Probably a civil engineer. Right?
Yeah.
When bombs blow up your city, you kind of need to know how to connect things back together and get stuff going. But he left. And he left because, oh man, it's a mess over here. My nation's just, this is a lot of work, buddy. I'll just come to America. It'll be a much better life. It'll be safer. It'll be better. To me, I hate to really cast shade on that. I'm not in that situation. So at very least, I think it would be better if he was a patriot. I think it'd be better if he was courageous and said, my nation needs me. I have these skills. I will stay. I won't be better off. And I want to make my nation actually succeed. Syria first.
Yeah.
I worry that we're setting up a market and we're luring people with economic incentives to be able to work and better their lives at the expense of their own nation. Now, the remittances, to me, that's a big, big deal because that does provide a benefit. That can be an act of patriotism. How do you see? I know that was the world's longest setup for a question,
No.
but what do you do with that? And how can we create a system which benefits America and Americans, but does so fairly without just luring people to abandon a properly ordered love of their host nation, their home nation?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a great point that you make there about patriotism, about the morality of where you're leaving. I think that's why it's so tough for people to actually leave. I think you hear about so many people coming across the border and everything else, but I also got to be concerned about, okay, why are they leaving? What are these people's situation that they took on that cost to continue to move to another country? And yeah, I mean, I definitely get your point about, like if you're in Syria and you want to leave, what happened? Like, why didn't you stay where you were in order to make it a better place?
I don't have a great answer. The only way I can answer is basically say, subsidiarity, you did solidarity. These things need to come to bear. And your first responsibility is to self and family.
Sure.
And if that's in opposition to your responsibility to your nation, I think the first people under your care are those God directly gave you, wife, children, right?
Yeah.
So if it's in that situation, then you're going to have to leave your country, right? Mary and Joseph left their first country.
Right.
May be reminded. They went to Egypt, right? It was Jacob and everybody else left during a famine, right? Because they couldn't feed their family and the other people attached to their household, so they had to leave, right?
Yeah,
and they had to set up. So I mean, I guess we kind of have some analogs there, but it gets tricky always on the borders, always on the edges of this about what are we doing here, and I don't have a good answer.
Yeah. I think your other point, though, is really important about, we're doing God's work, right? And so it may be that God's calling for us is to go to somewhere else and do something. I didn't anticipate to move to Washington, D.C. or to McLean, Virginia to work at the White House, 6 years after I finished my PhD. And I had 2 kids at the time. I've got 3 now. but that was, I felt, was my calling to go there. And ultimately, back in 2002, I got in a really serious car accident where we rolled 6 times, got life
Oh,
flight at Herman Hospital. I was a rock drummer before that. And so, not
okay.
necessarily living God's life, but I felt like that was his calling. It was wake up call for me, which set me on the path to be a first generation college student and got a PhD in economics that ended up working in the White House. I went to homeschool from 7th grade through 12th grade. So like
Nice.
that was my calling. And I still doing this every day. My Let People Prosper, I believe, is my calling. And so it could also be that, yes, there seems to be a morality to staying where you are, but it might not necessarily be where God wants you to be. And it may not be at the timing of where
Mm-hmm.
you need to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so for us not knowing what that all entails, it could be moral, right? For them to actually be leaving where they were going, or leaving where they're from, and then either coming back or sending remittances back, to your point, and other things. This could still fit within that paradigm. And yes, secondarily, you'd have signals from markets and prices and how things would move around. But I do think, to your point, it should be more about soul searching internally of what I could do best given the situation that I'm in, and that I want to do God's calling for my life. What's his will for my life versus what can I do to change things overall? I want to make sure that it's in his path. And us as Christians, I think, we've got a lot of good resources, the main one being the Bible, that
Mm-hmm.
tells us what's the path forward. And so it's not always easy, as just like we're talking about here. There are struggles. I face them every day in my own life with kids and wife and everything else. But at the same time, I believe I'm doing my calling and improving things as much as I can each and every day. And hopefully people will across the globe, and hopefully they'll all listen to this podcast and others, Jake.
Yeah, no, that's a great point that, what you're describing is, okay, God puts a call in your life to be able to often move. That happens a lot in the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to pursue what you actually have as the work of your life. And I think we're not privy to what that call is for each person. But if we did have a system which meant that whoever did get that call could respond to it,
Mm-hmm.
that seems like a better system.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, I don't know if we necessarily have that. But if we had a market-based system where if you are called, you can go, I think that'd be better because we
Yeah.
don't have that knowledge, right? And they do. So maybe that's the best we can do is make it so that if you're called, you can respond.
Yeah.
And that's as much as we can do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. You were a drummer before
I
a
was.
PhD student and then
Yeah.
working in the White House.
Yeah. I played in a hard rock band in Houston called Syndrome. And we played for several years, the late 90s, early 2000s. And then I turned everything around and started going on to the more academic route, which was a better position for me. And I still play drums. I got an electronic drum
Mhm.
set here in the house, and trying to teach my kids how to play at some point.
That's incredible. You must be in a very select. I mean, our last border czar was a big fan of Venn diagrams. I would
Yeah.
love her to do a Venn diagram for this one, which goes homeschoolers,
Yeah.
hardcore rock drummers,
Yeah.
economists.
Yeah.
You'd be the only one in the middle. Gotta be. There's no one else there. That's your Venn diagram.
Yeah. I like that. I like that. I have to put that up on my website at some point.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, we got to draw that one for sure. Um, awesome. Well, I tell you what. Let's kind of wrap up with kind of focusing on what the economic and cultural value of immigrants are. Kind of if you're
Okay.
talking to a very conservative audience, which is probably both of our audiences tend more conservative.
Mhm.
How would you make the pitch that if immigrants come into our nation's going to be better from an economic and just from a cultural standpoint? I mean, because I think a lot of people have had a bad taste in their mouth from how poorly the immigration system has been run.
Yeah.
My mother's a guidance counselor. She retired, but she was working in a city which was a sanctuary city. So they
Mm.
had something like 30 different languages being spoken in this elementary school.
Wow.
And they had certain problems of assimilation. You think problems of assimilation? What's the problem really, right?
Yeah.
Well, how about this one? Certain Middle Eastern countries, children are raised believing that if you're a boy, you don't have to listen to any women except for your mother. Right? Your
Mm.
mother has authority because she's your mom, but you don't have to listen to a woman. No. What, your teacher's a woman? No, you're a man and you don't have to listen to her.
Yeah.
And this causes problems in elementary schools,
Yeah.
as one would imagine,
Yeah.
right? And that's a cultural value that they hold, which means that when we try to put them in a regular public school, chaos ensues,
Yep. Yep.
right? So a lot of people have had problems like this, which are very difficult to negotiate. And I think they've lost the faith that immigration can be positive. So if
Yeah.
you kind of round it out with, here's your case.
Yeah.
A
Yeah. I think,
well-regulated, we stopped the border, we
right.
started a market system.
Yep.
What happens next?
Yep. What I would tell these folks is I understand your concerns. I think that's important part about this. At the same time, we should love our neighbor, as Jesus would tell us, and that no matter whether they're from in Virginia or in Texas or in other places across America, they're also our brother across the borders as well. And yes, rule of law is really important, but I believe strongly that people across the globe should know Christ and should know God. And how could we get them to know Christ even more without having to go there ourselves? And I believe strongly that mission people should do that on missions.
Mhm.
But you could also do it here at home and allow for this opportunity to take place from a Christian conservative viewpoint. But I also think about it from the standpoint that government is failing. This isn't a market failure. This is a government failure. And so
Mhm.
how can we correct this with more government? The situations that we're going to put in place, I think, will make us worse off because we won't have the same opportunities for workers to come here who otherwise would. It'd be too costly for them, and so then we lose out on the innovation, the technology, the economic growth and prosperity that we've been able to have here for centuries now. I think we would lose a big part of that if we didn't have immigrants coming to America, and it should be done legally. But I
Mhm.
think that within that legal realm, we need a market-based system that's easier for those who really want to come here and harder for those who are terrorists or other things or, bad people in general. But allow for the people who want to be here to come here as quickly as possible. And at the same time, we should be focusing on improving America from the federal
Right.
government having too high in taxes, too much in spending, too much in regulations. We should be getting rid of that as much as possible. Go Javier Milei on the regulatory state here in
Yep.
America, which Trump may do, by the way, here pretty soon. I think that's how I would try to connect more with the conservative groups and my friends and family and everything else of saying, let's not be so quick to point the fingers at someone else because we've still got three fingers pointed at ourselves.
That's awesome. It's something like a third or something of all S&P 500 companies were started by an immigrant,
Yeah.
which is radically higher than their population share. And
Yeah.
from what I've seen, as far as immigration being able to, speak language, sort into the labor force, et cetera, the rate of purchasing homes, when you compare the influx of, say, Mexican immigrants to past groups, say the Italians or the Irish, right? I
Mm-hmm.
see red hair on you, my
Yes.
friend.
Yes.
So,
What little I
the,
have. That's right.
yeah. So the Irish historically were one of the slowest assimilating groups in
Mm.
American history. And there was a big push against them, in part because a lot of them were Catholic.
Yeah.
But they were viewed as this lower class group. It took them a long time. And I think at this point, generations after, if people said, was it any good that the Irish came?
Mm.
People would say yes. And
Yeah.
guess what? Assimilation's happening faster than ever amongst, say, Latin American people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're going to look back and we're going to see this as positive, just as positive as the Italian influence, just as positive as the Irish influence. I think that that's probably going to be true, especially given the fact that lower criminality, higher rates of net taxpayers, we have a lot of really good signs. And yeah, there's always going to be stories of terrible things happening, but it happens amongst the native population too, guys. So got to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Um, well, thanks so much for
Yeah.
joining us. I really appreciate your thoughts on everything. You're always invited back. There's a
Great.
thousand things you brought up, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's a podcast. Like, what on earth to do with our crazy healthcare system? We've had a few people on for that, and taxes, and oh my goodness. So keep up the good fight. I do want to ask, what did you study in your economics PhD? What was the focus?
Yeah, it was on. The title was the macroeconomic effects of oil price shocks, and so I looked
Wow.
at the effects of oil prices on the economy, but also the economy on oil prices, because usually, in your textbook example is the supply shock of oil
Uh-huh.
prices, and you see supply shift to the left. But what my research was on is how the oil price shocks are endogenous, meaning they're related to what's going on in the economy and
Uh-huh.
global economy. They don't just come out of nowhere. They don't just you don't just see an oil price shock. And
Sure.
so with all of that, it also had implications for like fiscal and monetary policy. Because what we've seen in the past, when we had supply shock, inflation would rise dramatically. And in general, inflation wouldn't just increase only because oil price shocks go up. It was because the Federal Reserve looked at it as a supply shock. So they wanted to put more money in the economy to avoid a recession. But
Uh-huh.
instead, it led to higher inflation and money supply throughout the economy. And so my research was basically like, look, stop doing that. Allow for the shock to work its way out. And I think they're doing a better job of that actually over the last decade or so, of not putting the gas to the pedal, if you will, or their foot to the pedal, and making sure that we can bring down inflation. So I also looked at oil price, like forecasting gasoline prices given the oil price futures. So basically, I found that for every 10% increase in the price of oil futures, the month ahead contracts, you would
Uh-huh.
see a 2% increase in retail gasoline prices, unleaded, regular unleaded. And so that also was published in an academic journal. So I still keep my foot in that door on the academic side, but those are where I looked at the most. And it helped me a lot because I learned a lot of the econometrics and
Uh-huh.
thinking through the assumptions that go into all these models. And I think that's oftentimes what economists do a disservice to economics, is that they rely too much on their models and the data
Sure.
and not enough on the principles of what economics really is all about.
Oh my goodness,
A
yeah.
whole nother episode.
A whole nother episode.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've
yeah.
been it just I don't know. I've been really interested in what's going to go on with refineries
Mhm.
because I'm looking at utilization of and refiner capacity right now, and it's last time I checked pretty high,
Yeah.
and the ability to bring a new one online pretty hard.
Yep.
Yeah, very expensive. The regulatory red tape is ridiculous. Um, and there's a fair, I mean, it's a global market. We ship
Yeah.
the stuff all over the place, but it's globally bought and sold. And it's less like US sends it to the other side of the globe. And it's more like everybody shift the oil to your right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like things move locally, one after another. It's more like one domino hitting the next. So
Yeah.
I've been
I had
kind of watching.
I had an interesting discussion here recently with Daniel um, Turner from Power of the Future. He
Hmm.
was a recent guest on the Let Bill Prosper show, and he was telling me about how, yes, we're reaching all-time highs in oil production right now per
Hmm.
day and everything, um, but a lot of that's because of the permits that were put in place 4 or 5 years ago. Like it takes a while for a lot of this to come online. And so over the next few years, given that the Biden administration has restricted a lot of the permits and not given them out as fast as the Trump administration did,
Hmm.
unless something changes dramatically, we could see a pretty big slowdown in oil supply and the production, which would drive oil prices up, and gasoline prices up as well. So that's something else that we have to look forward to in the future and keep our eye on.
Okay, so I was really puzzled about that
Me too.
because if you see the numbers, conservatives are like, oh, they took away all of our oil production. It's like
Right.
we kind of hit record highs, guys. And
Yeah.
I thought, well, maybe the way that I kind of understood it, I don't know if it's true or not, was, well, yeah, a lot of the regulatory burden was there, but really what's they're most sensitive to is just oil price.
Yeah.
And oil price determines how much they're going to supply. And the increased regulatory burden, the decreased permits which are being put out, I kind of thought, well, that's just more going to hit their bottom line. That's
Hmm.
just going to hit their costs. And maybe in a Trump regime, that means that they'll just have similar output, maybe a tick
Hmm.
up, but
Yeah.
just higher profitability from lower costs of regulatory burden. Um, if that's it, I didn't know that it was that far. That makes sense that they
Yeah.
can't just turn on stuff immediately. It
Yeah.
takes that many years.
Yeah. I hadn't looked into that much detail into that particular one either, because I was kind of puzzled as well, because I didn't expect for this to take place. But I think it also indicates of why oil prices and gas prices are higher than they might otherwise be, given if there would have been a Trump administration.
Mm,
right? Think
mhm.
about the flip side of it, the counterfactual, if you will. Yes, we're at 13 million barrels of oil a day, but what if we were at 14 or 15 or 16? And that would have kept gasoline prices much lower than what they are today as well. So there's always that trade-off that's given on. So yes, what we see looks good, but the unseen is everything else that we missed out on over this period.
Right. And then, of course, it's you always got to look at both sides of the equation.
Yeah,
Demand, especially in anticipated demand with
yeah,
new AI data centers coming online.
yeah.
And then, just at the very most basic level, what we're doing in the economy to get growth is we're just reducing entropy. Like
Hmm.
at the most basic possible level, we're doing that. And definitionally, that requires energy.
Yeah.
There's a fellow who wrote a book, I forget the name of it, but he does an amazing amount of work tracking how many food and non-food calories
Hmm.
were able to be produced per person by year, going
Yeah.
back to like Abraham.
Wow. Wow.
And he tracks that whole thing and shows that basically as you bring coal in, the amazing thing is we can substitute
Mm.
non-food for food calories. And that was like the turning point.
Game changer. Come
Yeah,
on.
that's the
Yeah.
game changer. So I
Yeah.
kind of always have that in the back of my head. I'm like, all right, we're reducing entropy here. It requires energy.
Yeah.
And to the extent that we can do this is the extent that we can grow, plus whatever extent we can use materials and resources and energy efficiently.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah.
It's wild. I mean, I do think, and I've talked about this and given interviews on recently on Fox Business and others, but I think with the Trump administration coming in, I'm hopeful in some sense of what was happened during the first administration, particularly
Hmm.
the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the deregulation that took place, some of the criminal justice reforms. I think those were positive. What I think we could get more growth this time if they would follow it is having freer trade, especially with our allies,
Hmm.
is creating more of those free trade agreements for East Asian countries like Taiwan and others that
Oh
are over
yeah.
there. It would put more pressure on China to change their ways over time than any tariff ever will. And
Agreed.
and plus it grows our economy and it grows the people we can sell to and things of that nature. And so free trade would be big. And the other one is government spending. I know that government spending is added into the equation when you add up GDP, consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. But that's a Keynesian model. It doesn't look at the way that you take the money out at the same time. We have to pay for that government spending. And so I always look at government spending as a negative. It's a burden. You don't get the same dollar out of GDP that you do of government spending. I think most of the research now is between 6.6 and zero point 0.8. So that means you have a loss in economic
My
output for
goodness.
each dollar of spending that's coming out of the productive private sector. And so if the Trump administration would put more emphasis on free trade and cutting government spending, man, I mean, the sky is the limit, I think, of how much potential we could have in our economy, and allowing for much more growth than what we're projected to have, only about 1.8 to
Hmm.
1.9% per year.
Oh yeah. It's the government spending stuff. There's a lot of people, pretty public people, are saying, "Well, we're actually technically in a recession because you'd have to subtract out the net increase in government spending." It's like it's very short term, and even the
Yeah.
Keynesian guys who are all about money multipliers will readily admit that the money multiplier, if you believe in all that,
Yeah.
is much more positive in the private sector. And,
Yes.
it's not just the spending, which means that resources are in the hands of people who are less productive in creating goods and services. It also means that, well, if we're deficit spending, then we just have this buyer that comes into the capital markets and just bids with higher interest rates until they fund it.
Yeah.
They're spending our money. They don't
Yeah.
care. So
Yeah.
that's going to make capital resources more scarce,
Yeah.
and it's going to increase overall the interest rates as they have to fund more and more bond sales, which means the hurdle rate for new investments rises, which means
Yeah.
we just have foregone growth. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I see it
Yeah.
as a huge negative. If we cut government spending, I'm sure, very short term, we could see a dip in GDP, but
Yeah.
that's only until the market can reallocate that to a more productive use, which
Right.
isn't hard.
No,
We
no,
got
not at
this.
all.
We got
So
this.
I'm hopeful that like Elon Musk, he's talked about $2 trillion in cuts and things of that
Mhm.
nature. I hope they don't create a new office or agency. I don't want to see government expansion when you're trying to
I
cut
hear you.
government. I would rather them do something like a Grace Commission that the Reagan administration did back there in the 1980s, where they brought
Oh, okay.
private sector groups together for a commission and then they gave them their recommendations of what they should do. I think I would love to be on that, by the way, but I think that something like that would be better than doing it internally. Having the fox guard the hen house sort of situation if the government does it. But there needs to be some teeth. The problem with the Grace Commission and things like this is that there's not really teeth because Congress has to do this stuff. It's not going to be the executive branch. But with that, I think that maybe it might give Trump more reason to use the bully pulpit to actually talk about spending. We couldn't get him to do it in the first term. It's not his forte is to cut spending. He rather cut taxes. I mean, he's more of a populist, right? So it's hard to hand out stuff. But I think if there is a groundswell on the private sector to say, look, all the damage you're doing just from the things that you just mentioned, that may be the thing that pushes them over to saying we got to do something about government spending. And oh, by the way, if we had less government spending and lower deficits, it would also put downward pressure on the dollar because we wouldn't need to pay. We wouldn't need foreign currency to buy so much of our debt, which would allow for us to be more competitive across the globe. And so I brought this point up a lot while I was in the White House. Is like the president was always talking about depreciating the dollar, which I don't think we should be forcing it to. I want the marketplace to work, but you're counter to that if you're running deficits, because you're constantly putting upper pressure on the dollar. And by the way, tariffs also put upper pressure on the dollar, which means that just the same time you raise the tariff, you also get an appreciation of the dollar about the same amount, meaning it's just as cheap to buy the other goods, which is why the debt trade deficits don't go down. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about that as well.
It just turns into economic whack-a-mole. You tear up China, and then Vietnam's goods become cheaper because your dollar appreciated vis-a-vis the other. So you tariff that one, then it's economic whack-a-mole. It's just terrible, and you just end with less trade and less economic growth, and it's just
exactly.
If I could just get Trump and be like, Trump, all right, you can do this. I'll tell you how to fix the trade deficit. You ready? It's very easy. Dual deficit theory, my friend, right? So if we reduce the deficit, then, on one side we have a trade surplus or a deficit, and the other side we have a capital surplus or deficit. So if you really want to change the trade balance, you're going to have to change what's going on the other side. And our capital surplus currently is just represented by foreign dollars coming back to purchase primarily government bonds. So how about we issue less government bonds?
Exactly.
That's going to reduce that. Then you get more exports, and Bob's your uncle. And this has the benefit of changing our whole system from 45% of all spending is by government, state, local, and federal, to maybe a little bit less, and let people prosper.
There you go.
That money.
Get that knot off of us, the Gordian knot. Come on.
Exactly. It's the whole government's this giant tangled mess.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a lot of great ways to cut through. I'd love to see. I'm a big fan of things like, I'd love to see Medicaid, Medicare just replaced by some form of like healthcare savings account.
Yeah, same.
You get the value of if that was a private insurance deposited. So if you have cancer, listen, you're going to get more in your healthcare savings account because we're paying that cost basically.
Yeah.
And boy, that would be great. Social Security, same deal. Like the list goes on and on. Just make us czar. Make us.
That's right. We got this. Come on.
Our subjects will be thrilled. They're going to love it. Well, I probably took too much of your time already. What else do you have going on after this?
No, this is I'm working all the time on a lot of different groups, and think tanks across the country. And that's a lot of fun. I have I'm president of Ginn Economic Consulting, which I opened up 2 years ago, which has been phenomenal of being a business entrepreneur and working from home and being with my family more often. All those things are great. And my podcast, I'm going to keep going with that, Let People Prosper, which you can find on all the major platforms. I have a Substack newsletter, vanceginn.substack.com, where I put out my podcast, but also other types of newsworthy items throughout the week. And my website is vanceginn.com, where I have a lot of good information there as well, where I do speeches and try to talk, get the good economic word out as much as possible so that we can let people prosper.
Amen. You're fighting the good fight, my friend.
Yes.
Well, thanks so much for carving out the time. And thanks for joining me here. And listeners, you heard it. Go subscribe to Let People Prosper. Check out the website. Check out the everything. I'll throw in some links in the show notes too. All right. Well, thanks so much, Vance.
Thanks a lot.